Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to unpack one of the darkest, yet most consequential chapters in human history, the transatlantic slave trade. Our goal here is to really understand both the massive, calculated scale of this global economic machine and, of course, the devastating, unimaginable human toll it took on millions of lives. We'll be sticking strictly to the historical records and data to see exactly how this system operated.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Here's our roadmap for today. We're going to cover the driving forces behind the trade, map out the triangular trade network, follow the horrific journey of the Middle Passage, look at the quarantine and arrival processes, and finally, examine the Charlestown auctions.
Section 1. Driving Forces of Trade. To truly grasp how a system this inhumane could even flourish, we first have to look at the cold, calculated economic demands that actually birthed it.
When you look at the agricultural boom in the North American and Caribbean colonies, you see this massive, insatiable demand for manual labor. The colonists were growing incredibly lucrative cash crops, right? We're talking rice, tobacco, corn, indigo, and sugar. But cultivating these crops required intense, backbreaking work. At first, colonists tried forcing Native Americans into labor, or they used indentured servants, but as the agricultural economy just exploded, planters needed a much larger, cheaper workforce, one that would stay for life. So to maximize profits, British colonists actually looked to the precedents already set by Spanish and other European colonies using forced labor. It was this absolute, cold pursuit of profit that created a massive demand for a permanent, enslaved workforce.
Moving to Section 2, the triangular trade network. Because that immense demand for labor, it didn't exist in a vacuum. It gave rise to a massive, interconnected global web of commerce.
Just think about the sheer geographic scale of this network operating between 1525 and the early 1800s. We're looking at sweeping routes connecting Europe, Africa, South America, the Caribbean, and North America. This wasn't just some simple point A to point B shipping route. No, it was a highly complex, multi-continental, and incredibly profitable economic engine that literally sustained the colonial world for centuries.
Let's break down exactly what was moving across these ocean routes, because every participating region specialized in different exports. Europe shipped manufactured goods, cloth, ammunition, and guns down to West Africa. Then in West Africa, European and coastal African traders violently forced human cargo, enslaved African men, women, and children, onto ships bound for the Americas. The West Indies then used that enslaved labor to export sugar, molasses, and wood up to North America. And finally, the North American colonies shipped raw materials like lumber, furs, whale oil, rice, and tobacco straight back to European markets. It was this continuous, brutal cycle of supply and demand.
Over time, the logistics of this trade shifted as merchants were constantly looking to optimize their profits. In the early decades, enslaved Africans actually weren't brought directly to the 13 colonies. Instead, they were shipped first to the West Indies, with places like Barbados serving as a major indirect hub. But eventually, colonial planters and merchants realized, hey, we can increase our profit margins by cutting out the middleman, so they established direct trade routes with West Africa. This pivotal shift completely transformed colonial ports, especially Charlestown, into the primary hubs for the trade.
Section 3. The Middle Passage. As we get into this, we have to remember that these so-called commodities moving across the Atlantic were human beings, forced into an inescapable nightmare.
12.5 million. That is the staggering, estimated number of African captives violently ripped from their homes and forced into this migration to the Americas. Just let that number sink in for a second. 12.5 million individual lives swept up into this machinery of global commerce.
There's a famous 1787 diagram of the British slave ship Brooks, and it really exposes the extreme overcrowding and inhumanity designed to maximize a ship's carrying capacity. In fact, this historical document was used later by abolitionists to show the world the horrifying reality of the trade. Slave traders essentially treated human beings as cargo to be puzzle-pieced into the hull of a ship, packing more than 450 captives incredibly tightly into those lower decks.
The physical conditions below deck were unspeakably brutal. Captives were literally chained to one another, allotted only a few feet of space per person. That's barely enough room to move, let alone sit up. There was no fresh air, no latrines, creating an incredibly foul, suffocating environment. They were given dirty drinking water and just enough food to keep them alive, which was frequently spoiled. It was a system of absolute, unrelenting cruelty.
But data and diagrams can only tell us so much. To truly understand this, we have to look at the first-hand accounts of those who actually survived it. The enslaved writer Oladoa Aquillano lived through this horror, and he described the hold of the ship like this. He wrote, "The closeness of the place and the heat of the climate, added to the number in the ship, the air soon became unfit for respiration, from a variety of loathsome smells. The shrieks of the women and the groans of the dying rendered the whole a scene of horror almost inconceivable."
Section 4, Quarantine and Arrival. The Middle Passage was an agonizing journey of survival and suffering that lasted for weeks, sometimes even months. And tragically, reaching the shores of North America didn't mean the end of it.
Because of that horrific combination of extreme overcrowding, poor nutrition, and contaminated water, disease spread like wildfire below deck. Historical records show us that more than 1/3 of the captives died during the ocean crossing. And for those who did survive the journey and finally saw the mainland, well, they were often severely ill or weak. Because of this, slave ships arriving near Charlestown would anchor at sites like Sullivan's Island, which functioned as a mandatory quarantine station. Captives were held there in continued misery until they were deemed physically recovered enough to fetch a high price at auction.
Which brings us to Section 5, the Charlestown Auctions. Once they were cleared from quarantine, the captives were funneled directly into the brutal machinery of the sale.
The entire process of importing and selling enslaved Africans was a cold, highly mechanical routine designed strictly for one thing: profit. Let's walk through exactly how this worked. Step 1, as we just discussed, was that pre-auction quarantine at Sullivan's Island to ensure the so-called merchandise looked healthy. Step 2 involved unloading the captives, sending them straight to the market, and auctioning them off to the highest bidder. Step 3 is perhaps the most emotionally devastating part. Families who had miraculously survived the Middle Passage together were systematically torn apart right there on the auction block, often never to see one another again. And finally, Step 4 was the absolute stripping of their personal identity.
This final step is crucial to understand. Buyers systematically erased the identities of the enslaved, legally cementing their status as property to sustain that colonial agricultural machine we talked about earlier. Immediately following the sale, buyers would strip these individuals of their native names, punishing them for speaking their native languages or practicing their cultures. Slaveholders would assign them new English names. In the eyes of the law and society, these human beings were entirely reduced to property. And through this brutal, incredibly efficient process, Charlestown grew to become the primary port of entry for the entire transatlantic slave trade.
Now, this history is incredibly heavy, I know, but understanding the mechanics of this global trade is absolutely vital. We've traced this huge demand for cheap labor all the way from global economics down to the local auction blocks where human lives were literally traded for agricultural profit. So I want to leave you with a direct question from our source material to reflect on. Why do you think it's important to remember the sad, painful events in history as well as the good parts? If you were writing a history book, would you include the difficult parts of the story? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope this deep dive has given you a clearer understanding of the facts, the sheer scale, and the profound human impact of the transatlantic slave trade.